we felt like we needed to do both leadership perspective, but also tactical perspective on how to manage your office as a practice owner in the middle of COVID-19 crisis. Okay, welcome back to another episode of, this is technically Practice Underwater. I'm invading your show, so thank you guys for letting me join you.
Well, and it wouldn't be Practice Underwater without me ripping Matt for something and him going back at me. So I think I want to jump right into it because I'm pretty hot right now. I'm pretty pissed.
Well,
we were recording. We had blocked out this 2-hour window to record these 2 episodes. So you guys heard Wednesdays,
which was spontaneous. Matt knew nothing about
that's so misleading.
We had pre-scheduled.
We did not pre-schedule this. The way it went down, I was at my house raking leaves, trying to stay busy, get some vitamin D. And then I see my phone barrage of texts, probably 15 texts about how we need to do an emergency recording because George has to go on a very urgent camping trip. So we got to make sure we get it in before his big time camping trip.
Okay, I disagree with the way this is going. Anyway, so back to my side of the story here. We were recording. And then we finished the first hour. Okay. Anytime you've been on Practice Underwater, we do 2-parters. It's a pause. Hey, how's it going? Maybe top 30-second check-in. And then we're recording again for the second part. Matt needs like a 10, 15-minute lunch break here. So we take a minute, we pause, and then Matt goes and eats while I'm just sitting here waiting.
It's 2 o'clock on the East Coast. I missed lunch. It's past lunchtime. My stomach's growling. At the office, I never miss lunch. I'm eating. Like these dentists who work through lunch, that's not me.
I would have been more on board with you muting your mic and eating while we're recording than I would waiting for you to eat lunch before we record, to be honest.
I'm so sorry for that time you had to wait, George.
I was fully on board with the lunch break.
Thank you, Richard.
Completely reasonable. We are grateful to have you. This was last minute.
Thank
and I'm glad this all came together. And I'm glad to see George.
I appreciate that.
I'm furiously shaking my head right now. This is not okay.
It's not acceptable. Well, before we lose anyone.
Apparently we take lunch breaks on the Shared Practices podcast now.
We do, but it's a podcast, so they don't have to experience it. So you're actually the one who's extending the lunch break into the episode, George.
Exactly.
But let's get into this. We felt like we needed to do both leadership perspective, but also tactical perspective on how to manage your office as a practice owner in the middle of COVID-19 crisis. This is a big financial question mark for a lot of people, practice and personal. And we wanted to look at how can you stretch this out so that you can survive longer in all of the unknown timeframes that we have in front of us. So, Matt, you're excited about this. Why are you excited about the details of this? Like, what gets you going about this?
Well, like when George says there's nothing he likes better when a staff member is crying in his office, there's nothing I like better than a client coming to me saying, I need to lower my overhead. Like, came to the right place. So it's just what I love doing. I love cutting expenses. So I think it's important in this time, obviously, managing cash flow, like holding on to what you have and minimizing any expenses that you can. And just like asking, this is going back to a lot of our difficult conversation, advice, asking the different vendors for some forgiveness in this tough time. And, I think most of what we've seen around Facebook, other dentists, they're getting that from vendors. So I wouldn't shy from those conversations.
And I think it's helpful if you frame this. The framework I'm looking at this from is, what are your fixed expenses? What are your variable expenses as a practice? And then also personally. I think if you're not taking a hard look at all of that right now, you're not doing everything that you could.
Can I add a wrinkle to this conversation?
Always.
So I feel like there's the added level of, well, sure, we can manage this time. But then after this time, there's likely going to be an economic recession. I think we can all agree that that is a likelihood at the very least. Can't predict the future. And what are you doing to prepare for that? Because when there is an economic recession, there are a lot of opportunities. And I think there's also a more positive, hopeful message that I'd hope to share as well of, if you can get through this time, you can position yourself very well for what's to come after that.
No, and whether that's an associate who's looking to buy a practice, and maybe for a dentist this is like the final straw, and they're like, I'm ready to move on, or whether that's someone who's starting their investing career and they're saying, I want to invest in the stock market, and this crash is going to allow me to get in at a low moment rather than getting in at a high moment and start my investing career at a good spot. So I think there's and personal finance, coming out of this on with a more stable practice, a more stable personal life. You've trimmed things down, setting yourself up for years of success with this in the back of your mind of, I need to live my life and run my practice so that I can survive another event, whether it's a war or whether it's a personal crisis rather than a national crisis. There's a ton of good things that can come out of this. So I completely agree.
So like Matt looks at things and he gets very excited about the idea of cutting costs. For me, what gets me really excited is a situation where people have a lot of emotion attached to it, and taking all the emotion away from it and looking at it from a very tactical perspective of how can I use this situation and the realities that come with it to best position myself for the future, right? And I think that's a conversation that needs to be had in context of this conversation as well, because ultimately managing your practice and your cash flow has a lot to do with your ability to succeed moving forward. So I think it's all kind of related, but I also think there's just a general opportunity moving forward as well.
Agreed.
Okay, cool.
Can I jump back to one thing Richard said? So with the fixed and variable expenses, in times like this, there are no fixed expenses. Like your practice loan is now variable. Many of them are delaying in 90 days. Your rent can be negotiated. Your student loans can be put on deferral or interest only or decrease in payment. Like you need to look at every expense you have and see what you can cut and what people are willing to do to help you out with them.
Well, perfect. Let's start with that then. So let's start with the biggest expenses. So biggest practice expenses that are traditionally considered fixed, but all of a sudden are now have a potential of being variable. Let's look at bank loans. Did you guys contact your lenders?
So staff is your largest expense.
Staff's largest expense, yeah.
Fixed.
Staff is fixed.
Which will go, I mean, at the very least, will go down in this time. You know, whether you are just doing the pay time off and then unemployment, or whether you're doing something like George is doing with the kind of office stimulus package he's giving. So I think we've touched on a little bit in the past episode.
That was like last episode, absolutely.
Right.
So
if you have questions about staff and how we handle that, refer back to Wednesday's episode, and we'll touch on it a lot in there.
And that one is the hardest, quote unquote, expense to like handle. And I'm glad we had a whole separate episode for that, because this is people's lives that we're talking about, rather than buying a bank or whatever. Yeah. This is there's a lot more to that, and a lot more implications in the decision making around that expense. And so giving it the gravity, giving it the empathy and the compassion and the understanding that it deserves is why we did a whole episode. So let's say that you've now arrived at whatever the situation is with your team members. Now we're looking at rent and the loan on your practice as two of the things that normally don't go away and don't change. I reached out to my landlords and got a variety of expenses or of responses, from yes, absolutely, let's figure something out, to hey, I need a whole set of documents before we're willing to even talk, including your business insurance and your P&L from last year, P&L from this year. So for one landlord, it was a conversation on the phone and we arrived at a point. For another landlord, it was like, hey, we need proof and documentation. Have you guys done anything yet? I mean, what was your experiences?
I, like many of the dentists out there, got 90-day deferral on my practice loan. And he was very clear in that we're starting with 90 days. We understand it might even be longer. So we're open to even doing it longer if needed. So I think that's a baseline that obviously everyone has to do. My student loan minimum payment was cut in half with my bank. I've reached out to my landlord. I've talked about my landlords before on this podcast on my initial interview. And, I'm not expecting a lot of help. I'm thinking more they're going to be asking for documents. They're going to be a little bit of a pain in the ass on this. And I think the main takeaway is don't be afraid to ask anyone, any company, any bank for help. This is the time that we need assistance, and most of these institutions will assist you in some way.
And I also think it helps to understand from their perspective. For a landlord, I've reached with one of them, I've reached an agreement where we are paying a reduced half rent for a period of time for 60 days. And then we're going to make that up by the end of the year. Because at the end of the day, you're still in that space and they can't be renting it out to someone else. So it's not like they can just forgive or defer your rent till later. Maybe some of them can. And it doesn't hurt to start off asking for, could we defer 3 months rent and pay that later? But you will kind of have to make that up usually. versus with a loan, if you defer payments, they're going to accrue more interest on that. And so it's almost a little bit more reasonable for the bank to say, hey, we'll defer for 3 months, but you're going to pay that on the back end.
Most are doing interest free also.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's if for some reason it seems like every bank that we've heard from is doing the same thing. 3 months, no interest, no payment, and then it just gets added. So if you have a 10-year loan, you now have a 10-year and 3-month loan.
Right. Exactly.
For the same amount.
So perfect. You guys are hearing interest free. And obviously if you've got a bigger loan or you've got something more specific, and this is also where if you've got an institutional lender, it really helps out versus if you've gotten like a personal loan. But I guess a personal loan, you can work out terms with, a family member or whoever that may be. But giving yourself at least 2 to 3 months on all of these major expenses. Have you reached out, George, on student loans at all?
So my student loan strategy makes it such that this question doesn't super apply to me.
Okay.
I'm under the repay program, and currently my payment is 0. So,
and to explain to anyone who doesn't understand that, you're coming at this from it. It's a certain percentage. Is it 15% or 20% for you of your income from last year? Is
10.
Your payment 10%?
Oh, actually 15. It's 15.
It's 15%. So it's 15%. But because you bought a practice, you can write off a lot of that initial depreciation, and so your income on the books last year,
taxable income is incredibly low. Yeah,
incredibly low. So you already didn't really have a student loan payment to speak of.
Yeah, this was kind of by design. Was the first 2 years of my career to not have to deal with my student loans and to have them growing at like a 3% rate was my objective. So that accomplished that. Did
you refinance at all?
No, the 3% is the repay program where they forgive half of your unpaid interest.
That's right.
And so if my payment is 0, then all of my interest is unpaid interest, and then half of it gets forgiven. So
nice. Okay. So once again, a strong point for how student loans shouldn't prevent you from getting into practice ownership, because practice ownership changes your taxable income dynamics so drastically for the first few years that you can really use it to your advantage. Okay, so mortgage and rent, that's another thing that have you guys looked into or reached out to anyone about your personal mortgage and rent in your home life?
So my office, I haven't talked about my landlord. My landlord is my seller.
Okay.
So a lot of compassion and sympathy from them. They were practice owners. They get it. They've been very cooperative. So I guess I come from the standpoint, and maybe it's a place of pride, and maybe this is an area where Matt doesn't agree with me on. I like my personal rent. Like, I can afford to pay it. And, they're not going to, I don't own a home. I rent my house, and I'm not going to like go to them and ask them to waive rent for me, because other people might need that benefit more than I do. So in my personal life, I'm handling it a lot differently than I am my professional life. In my professional life, I'm very aggressive about pursuing every avenue to cut costs. In my personal life, I'm sort of just, handling my business.
And this comes back to the conversation we had last time about how you live your life, the buffer that you have in place, the liquidity that you have on hand. That's something at the beginning of this year, I had a very strong impulse that I needed to have more of an emergency fund built up in my personal life. And there were some things that came up, and I just felt like, you know what, I need to have a buffer. And so this year, that's what I've been focused on building. We're only 3 months in, but I just had this sense that I need to have more cash on hand personally. And so that's the focus, that if you've had that focus, now you can make that decision personally and say, hey, I don't need to pursue all of these benefits for myself. Let's leave those for others. However, there are people who have refinanced their loans, who are associates, who are working for someone else, and all of a sudden they have zero income. They've gone from producing dentistry, and they get, whatever percentage of that, to all of a sudden they have zero, and they're the sole provider, and bills are due and rent is due. So the personal circumstances that you find yourself in, don't feel guilty if you have to ask for help.
Oh, 100%. If you have to, you do it.
You ask for help.
Yeah. No doubt about that. Yeah.
So, but I also think it's great that if you're in the position where you don't have to on certain things, that's also a good thing as well. And it's okay.
Like my property management company that owns my rental home they sent an email saying, if you absolutely need it, we can work something out. But it seemed like there was resistance in the language of that. And it seems like they would require documentation for that type of thing. And I just, I don't know. I didn't feel like I would get it. Didn't want to go down the road.
And a lot of it, what would be, moved or whatever, you'd have to pay at some point.
Have to pay back anyway. Yeah. And, I don't see I'd rather somebody who really needs that company has the ability to do that because I'm paying my rent.
Right. And I didn't reach out to my mortgage bank about my personal house. But I think one prudent move for owners is definitely look into the line of credit as a kind of safety net. I've already had leftover one from when I bought the office 2 years ago. My financial advisor advised me that that's kind of your first step. And then further on from that, if we were to need more for whatever reason, SBA loan would probably be the logical next one to look at.
So can I add on that?
Yeah.
So I think I think compared to the average dentist, I'm fairly liquid, and my ability to get through this time is probably I'm probably on the further end of the spectrum for my necessity for a loan. However, I am still pursuing that loan. Due to the unique situation that we're in, the terms are very desirable right now for a loan, especially with the government funding that's going around. And so from my perspective, I want to further my liquidity entering a recession. And so I think it's prudent to pursue financing regardless of your feelings on needing it because of how cheap the money is that's being offered. I think it's just responsible to stock up. And likely with the rates that you're at, if you don't use it for getting through this time, you could potentially reuse it for, something down the road that might be even more helpful.
Or you could even just give it right back, if you don't.
Yeah, like they're doing 12 months interest-free, no payments on some of the stuff. So that's just holding money for a year and see what happens.
So for someone who hasn't had a line of credit open before, Matt, can you talk us through what does that look like and how does that work?
Usually when you buy a practice, you get working capital. Normally that's in the form of a line of credit. Most people, depending on the liquidity of the practice you buy, won't use all that's allowed to you. So I think I was allowed up to 125K. I probably used maybe 50.
Wow.
So that's all there. I'm pre-approved. Everything's good. I literally just have to send an email. I get that money in hours. So if you don't have already one of that set up, email your practice loan bank and they can set you up with that. You want to get that rolling.
What's the interest rate on that, Matt?
It's similar to my practice loan. It's probably 4.8 in that range.
Okay.
Which ends up being more than an SBA loan, which is 3.75 or some of these interest-free ones out there. But it's just nice that it's instant. It's right in your bank account. There's not a waiting period. But he recommended doing that, soon, even if you don't see yourself having to use it because it's there if you need it.
What's the repayment like on that? So it's kind of this flexible pool of money that you can draw on. How do they structure the back end of that?
Well, they'll also put it with the 90-day deferral. So it'll also be deferred with the normal practice loan. So
and then it's a 10-year note or something like that?
Yeah, 10-year note.
So
holy cow, Matt, I didn't realize it was spread out over that long.
Matt, you bought your practice and you got this line of credit. Did you use a line of credit as your baseline operating capital?
Yeah, it's like to pay payroll in I use it for the payroll the first month, 2 payroll cycles, some other little expenses, but just use that 50K that I needed and then didn't ask her anymore.
Accountants typically want you to have 1 month's break even in your business bank account. Did you use that working capital as your 1 month's break even that you've just always kind of kept in your business bank account?
Pretty much. Yeah.
Okay. Mine came differently. My working capital was not a line of credit. It was a loan for the full amount that got deposited into my bank account on the day of close.
Gotcha. Yeah. So when I pay my practice loan every month, there's the big chunk that goes towards the actual loan, and then there's a very small chunk that goes towards
your line of credit.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. No, that's awesome. And I think a lot of people who haven't explored that or don't have that, or maybe they were like George and their working capital came as part of the initial bundle and it just came out as a distribution, and it's not a revolving line of credit, should look into this.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. Even I'm thinking, definitely, yeah, that sounds great. Yeah.
Yeah. So looking into line of credit, SBA, what do you know about that next step of if you've got a working line of credit, now you need more for some reason. how are they setting that up now, and how is that different than in the past? And if you don't know and you don't want to
I
go
mean,
deep,
I know it's up to 2 million. It's 3.75, I believe, I don't know the actual length of years.
Do you mind if I kind of know more about this than you do?
Go for
probably. It's up to 2 million. I think a common number that's being thrown around is 50 to 100 for a lot of situations. Because a lot of states are in a state of emergency, that's one of the requirements to get the disaster loan program, which is what it's being called. And it's a 2.5 to 3.75. And right now they're offering 12 months, no payments, no interest. And then after that, it can be amortized over as long as 30 years. So these are the most favorable terms we've ever seen. I mean, money has never in a very long time been offered at those terms.
How long do you think this kind of money being that cheap and easy to get will last? Like, do you expect this to last for months, or do you think this is something that's more in the interim?
So that program is open until the end of this calendar year. However, I'm not sure of how much funding they have and when that dries up. And right now we're talking my personal views and on everything. My personal view is right now with the recession coming, I want to get as liquid as possible, as fast as possible. And so I've already sent in an application for that program and I'm waiting to hear back.
So SBA, like in dental lending for practice acquisitions, it's kind of like the last step, and you're like, oh,
this is totally opposite. Yeah, because this is now a completely different thing because of this disaster. The terms, so the reason it's the last step is because it has the most regulations and it has the most fees, and it usually doesn't have a great rate.
Okay.
However, because of this situation and the government's desire to help small businesses, it's now that kind of, the red tape is still there, but the rates and the fees are not what they are usually.
George, I want to go back. Sorry, Richard. To you mentioned the opportunities in this. Like, where do you see the opportunities for a dental practice owner? Once the dust settles with all this.
Well, let's think about it more historically speaking. Recessions historically are areas in which wealthier become wealthier, and that's just historically the way recessions work. That is their purpose in our economy, is to sort of reset things a little bit. And people that have access to capital during a recession are able to take advantage because there are not many people with capital. And so ultimately, regardless of how you deploy your capital, you want to be deploying it in an economic recession. And so if I can access it, as much of it as possible, then, you just make decisions. So whether it be, right, Richard talked about buying stocks or real estate in my situation would be an attractive option. A lot of different things you can do with capital in a time of economic recession. And it would behoove you to, right, you wait for these opportunities. And when they come, you want to be prepared because they don't come around very often.
Can I share a personal example here?
Please.
When I started dental school in 2011, got the Army scholarship, part of that was a $20,000 signing bonus. That was right at the bottom. Well, not, at the bottom. But
it was in Phoenix, the housing market.
Especially in Phoenix. The housing market crashed so hard. We bought a foreclosure for $120K and lived in this home for 3 years, rented it out the last year. We moved in. My parents also in Canada bought a home in Phoenix in the same neighborhood that we did, because when you factor in the fact that Alberta didn't have, in Canada, they didn't have a recession because they had oil and the Canadian exchange rate. Like, people in Canada were scooping at homes in Phoenix left and right because in comparison, it was like being a New York person and looking at Phoenix real estate prices in 2011 is no big deal. So we bought a house, they bought a house. We ended up selling that house by the time we got out of dental school and made $50K. And it was no genius.
And you lived for free for 3 years.
Exactly.
Nice.
We got to, contribute towards that. So I remember thinking, I got big into real estate in dental school. I got my real estate license. I wanted to get my CCIM, my commercial certification, and long-term wanted to do commercial real estate. But I remember thinking, I don't know if we're ever going to see a recession like this in real estate again. And I was bummed that I was a young dental student who really didn't have much liquidity to speak of, and I couldn't take advantage of more the opportunities that were out there.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about this. I think it's important to note, usually real estate recessions are the longest that is the last thing that hits in the economic recession because it usually follows the unemployment rate. So typically you'll have business impacted first, then you'll have the unemployment rate, and then it'll be followed with the real estate. So in this situation, right, you look forward to you're just projecting. I think there's a fairly good chance that we might be in one coming up. And, if you want to take advantage of that, then you need to have capital. And that's the thing that people won't have, hence the low prices. But for me, the rates are going to be low too. And so rates are low, then that's when I want to lend. I want to get as much lending as possible. And so I potentially might refinance my practice note. I'll potentially buy a personal home, which I haven't done yet. Or, there's a lot of, take advantage of this time. I mean, I'm sorry to be optimistic in a crisis. I'm not saying that the crisis is positive. I'm just saying that the effects of it can be positive. And
are you guys forecasting as far as like, say, just play it out, this goes for 4 months? Do you guys forecast dental offices closing because of this?
Yes.
Oh, I mean, there are. I mean, can you imagine being that dentist that I described on the last
that's what I was
episode?
about to say. Richard just described the dentist whose practice is closing.
Leveraged $1.7 million of personal debt, not practice debt, not anything else. I can't see how that person doesn't go bankrupt and their practice doesn't get seized.
So even if the situation, doesn't bankrupt the dentist, it'll take away all of their liquidity and savings. And then if we have a recession that follows it, I mean, there's going to be, so from a buyer's perspective, if I'm an associate right now, everyone's terrified of buying a practice. I'd be very excited about the possibilities because there's going to be a lot of practices for sale. I was
think
talking
there's
to
be more of
Phoenix.
that than like a dentist now saying, I have to keep working longer than I forecasted?
I've talked to brokers in my market and sellers are calling. Yes.
Well, I think people already did that in 2010 is they said, I have to work longer because of the last recession. And so I think there was a lot of people hanging on to practice ownership.
I think you have a majority of dentists who didn't want to sell just because they're, they don't have the motivation. They financially could retire, but they're like, you know what? Yeah, I'm just going to hang out for a few years. And then this happens. Now they want out. Stressful.
Yeah.
That's what's happening.
Last straw. Yeah. I'm over this. I'm done. And also here's I don't want to go too morbid with this, but like for a dentist who is over 55, over 65, like with us being at the most risk of coronavirus, I can see a lot of people saying, you know what? I've taken enough risks over my career, both as an entrepreneur, as a healthcare provider of needle sticks and infections and all of that. I'm kind of done with this. So I think there is definitely an age bias to who is the most scared of this crisis right now.
Yeah. And again, going back to the liquidity, entering a potentially, right, let's just say you do want to buy another practice or you want to buy your first practice, being liquid and being able to go ride out a tough time and getting your practice at a steep discount because of it is a very wise financial move. So again, I cannot, if we're going to talk about the opportunities in the episode, whether it be cutting your expenses to ride at this thing out longer, we cannot harp on the value of liquidity enough.
And this is one of my favorite things about Reese Harper and Dentist Advisors, that I came from the brainwashed Dave Ramsey camp of anti-debt. And for me, Reese Harper was who converted me into the camp of liquidity and then smart payback as you choose fit, investing and paying back down loans and all of that, but coming from a place of liquidity as the number one place to be in. And then everything else stems from there.
Well, Matt, I think there's an interesting debate, and I'm curious to get your take on it because I don't know if we'll be on the same page here. I have my credit card, my office credit card. I am continuing to make that payment in full. I am not currently deferring that payment for the 20% interest that comes with it. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
No, I'm with you on that. I don't plan on keeping a balance. And then I think with so many of my expenses now being cut, that bill is not going to be very high. And that's something I'm able to pay. So I won't, I'll look to other avenues for liquidity before I.
Now let's go back to office opportunities as well. So I have one of the big things we're going to be working on while we're closed is collections and staying up to date on our, going unpaid claims and trying to collect as much as possible. Because dentistry is kind of unique in the sense that you don't get paid for what you do the day you do it. So this period, we can almost sort of buffer it a little bit more because we're collecting off of past production during a time where we were allowed to practice. And then when we ramp up, we just have a little bit of a collection step where we might be producing and not collecting as much, but typically that's an okay situation as well. So I almost feel like we have the ability to kind of in our industry is unique in that way.
I want to hear you guys' thoughts on this. So as I mentioned last episode, I'm big on the social distancing. So I don't want to have any of my staff members at the office doing tasks just because I don't want them around another person. I'm going to have one person there at a time, when I'm not there doing emergencies. So are you guys in your offices what are you having your staff work on either remotely or in office during this time where you guys are semi-closed?
Yeah, so we're catching up on things that we were actually starting to fall behind on stuff. So my practice has gone through periods of a lot of growth, and we were falling behind on a few areas. And so, mainly my AR days were up to about 35 pre-crisis, and typically we like to operate at 25 or less. And so, typically that's an area where, we really wanted to stay responsible. And so collections and, patient balances, that's what we're really focusing on right now, is getting cash flow into practice.
How about anything like in the systems realm, any manuals, trainings, any kind of supply inventory, any of that kind of stuff you're tasking?
If I hadn't done inventory management, I would have given, that's what, when I talk to clients on the phone, we are talking about inventory management right now, because how can you use this opportunity in such a way to build yourself, lower overhead in the future? Creating solid systems for inventory management during this crisis seems to be an appropriate decision in my mind.
And I don't really have much to add or contribute. Each office is kind of unique, and each office has certain stuff going on, but we're not in a position to really tool things up or work on systems right now.
Gotcha.
So I will say that a lot of the variable expenses, we haven't really talked about those because they kind of disappear on their own, hence the variable expenses. Supplies, lab bills.
Well, there are, Matt, are you calling your labs and having them postpone payment as well? Because usually there's a lag in that as well.
Yeah, I have reached out to a couple of labs about that. But most other thing I pay as I go, like supplies.
They're as affected as we are. I think that's the hard part I have, is feeling good about calling a lab and saying, hey, postpone my payment, when, reality is the lab guy's not getting any cases either.
It's a request. It's an ask. It's not to say they have to honor it or they have to do it. But I have no problem personally with making a request in times like this. And, I think even if they're not able to honor it, they're not offended by an ask.
Sometimes you want to take into account their side of things, and how much are you really going to save with certain things. Like, for instance, on Swell, I talked with some of the guys at Swell. They have some real costs that they eat whenever they turn an account on and turn an account off. How much are we really going to save if we shut this down for 2 weeks?
Yeah, like $150 a month. Like, is that really going to? And I get that it adds up, but at the same time, I have a hard time with some of these things. I feel like if I'm in a position where I can pay, I would like to.
Yeah.
But again, that's personal philosophy. I think for the most part, I would take your biggest expenses and try to cut them down, and then evaluate maybe your other ones.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest expenses and the ones that just don't make sense at a time like this. Like, I'm doing Facebook marketing for implants, and that's something that's easy to pause. Google ads, I'm not doing that anymore. But I am having someone continue to run my SEO. I'm still keeping Golden Goose to answer my new patient calls. I'm keeping Swell. Some things I'm choosing to keep, whereas others just don't make sense at a time like this, no matter how much they save you.
Yeah. No, absolutely. No, and that's where going line by line, item by item through all of this and making an intelligent decision is what it means to be a business owner. So
I will say this:
shutting everything down.
Bruce Baird had a post on Facebook about something similar to this. We don't use his company, however, we do in-office payment plans, and we collect a solid $12,000 to $15,000 a month off of those. That's kind of nice right now. I do admit, I think that having diversified your income sources as an office, whether it be insurance, payment plans to patients, other sources of income, it does prepare you better for times like this.
Interesting.
So I'm actually quite thankful that we've built up a pool of, treatment that is now being paid on.
And I think there's an opportunity here for practice owners who haven't really taken control of their finances. Maybe don't look through their credit card statement every month. Like, don't look at their bank account too often. This is a time where you can actually see where your money's going and start to like, all right, let's make a better plan going forward. It's like a reset button. I think a lot of people can hit. And George just raised his hand there because I guess he doesn't look at his
I
credit
don't look
card.
at my credit card statement every month. No, that does not happen.
This is an opportunity for you then, George.
You would see a lot of meals and entertainment expenses on there.
This is why I am now taking control of the shared practice finances, and we're getting that off George's plate because
no, I'm talking about my office credit card. I wouldn't put that stuff on the shared practices account.
Richard. No, but I totally agree. We need to take control of the shared practices. There's going to be some gear on there. Matt's like, what is this equipment that you bought, Richard? I thought you already had 5 mics. Why are you buying another one?
Yeah, I agree with that one. But in general, though, I do have a very good understanding of every expense that I have on a monthly basis. I just don't comb through the statement every month. That does not me.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would just don't have a full understanding at all, even without having looked at it. They just, they pay it off every month. They don't ever comb through it. So I think, it's just a time for it.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, I think we can wrap this up. I think we've started off with what are the big rocks and tackling those first. And then immediately secondary to that is what can I do to give myself more breathing room, more liquidity, and what lending is available to me right now that normally would not be available. Establishing that, and then you can start to get in the weeds. And doing it in that order is going to give you a sense of control, a sense of intelligence to the way you're doing this, and set you up for success. So is there anything else that you guys would add in terms of financial tactics? Go for it.
In general, more of a mindset thing, but this is a time of crisis. People are panicking. Your ability to stay level-headed, calm, objective, look at your situation, and tactically make decisions that are best for you, your family, your practice, your staff, and ultimately, when everyone is running away from something, running towards it sets you up for success in the future. That's time and time again, historically, what we've seen. I encourage objectivity. I encourage taking emotion out of it and looking at the situation and doing what's best for you, your practice, your family. And ultimately, if you have the ability to take advantage of it financially, then you should.
Yeah, and I'll echo that, George. I mean, that's a lot of kind of the sentiment we shared on Monday's episode, to kind of lean into this uncomfortable time, because there is opportunity. There's opportunity for personal growth. There's opportunity for, things you can do cash-wise. So as uncomfortable as it may be, this is where you lean in and this is where you grow. And the opportunity is usually behind the big problem in facing you in the face. So I would look there rather than trying to resist.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll cap this off with our hearts also go out to those who can't make these same decisions and jump on opportunities as this crashes. There are people who, this kind of a conversation that we're having right now, they're still nowhere near being able to cope with the reality of this, and their situations are far more dire. This also goes back to you guys bought great practices, and part of that and part of the skill set of shared practices is finding a practice that has enough breathing room to survive the bumps, and having bought right and managed it right after buying it is allowing you guys to weather this crisis and come out better on the back end rather than having this destroy you. And our heart goes out to those who are not in that scenario for whatever the situation may be. And we don't want to seem calloused in talking about the opportunities as all of this is burning, but in reality, if you can have the right mindset and you can come about this with the right attitude, you will come out better on the back end of this.
Yeah, and the last thing I wanted to do was be insensitive to the crisis itself. I just, as a person, tend to really my way of looking at things tends to be, this is my situation. I try not to have emotion attached to it, and what can I do moving forward? And so those are my thoughts, right? And if they offended anybody, that was not my intention.
Thoughts and prayers too. We lost one in our profession outside of Nashville, so thoughts and prayers to his family and everyone dealing with that. And I think I even saw a dental assistant also passed in Washington. So we're all being affected by this. So everyone, stay safe out there.
Absolutely. Well, we will be here next week, and I think we're gonna. I guess we should mention, and this is something maybe I'll record a little segment and tag it on to Wednesday's episode before it goes out. Peyton Keller.
I gave him a shout out on Monday.
Oh, good job.
On Monday,
yeah.
you did? Okay, cool. Good.
108 pages.
Yep. Him and Danielle both did some amazing offerings for our group.
So you did a shout out to Danielle as well on Mondays. Okay, perfect. Well, then you guys have already heard. If you didn't hear Monday's episode, go back and listen to that one. But Peyton took all 5 seasons, all 180 something episodes we're at now, 190, and created a 108-page Google Doc of notes from shared practices, all of the previous seasons. So if you're now in a situation where you're like, man, I actually have a whole lot more listening or reading time, join our Facebook group and check out that document. And George and I were talking off air about how it would be fun to get him on air, talk to him about this, but then also look at that and see where our opinions have changed. See what we've learned and grown. So, because, go ahead.
I believe that I am in the most episodes on this show than anybody else.
Do you want us to rename it just to your name?
No,
the George
but that is a point of pride I do have, where I have been on the Shared Practices podcast more than any other person.
Well, thank you, George, for doing that. And I will say, George bailed me out of a personal crisis where Shared Practices almost died. And if it weren't for him, we would not be going today. So thank you for sustaining
George.
it. And you had, very early on, George had some ambition of being both the most listened to and, having the most episodes out there. So I think you've probably done it all now, George.
Yeah, I haven't counted in a while, but I believe that is a fact still.
He's really humble about it.
Yeah, very, very humble. I don't ever acknowledge it. You would never know from talking to me, but
I'm so glad that we get to kind of share all of this together, and I think this is going to be a time of both pain looking back, but also, I mean, some of the posts I've seen of people who they're helping their kid ride their bike without training wheels for the first time, and all of these moments together and the memories and the things that we won't take for granted. There's a lot good to come out of this in the end. So we'll wrap it up. We'll talk with you next Monday on the Shared Practices podcast.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Practice Underwater. We'll see you guys next week.
If you're interested in one-on-one coaching with either Dr. George Hariri or Dr. Matt Garino, our contact emails are in the show notes.
And if you're interested in being on Practice Underwater as a guest, where we could look at your practice anonymously, you can go ahead and contact the email in the show notes and follow those directions to get on the show. Thanks, and we'll see you guys next week on Practice Underwater.